Welcome to 7 Ways to Facilitate Effective Online Discussions, co-sponsored by Magna Publications and the Online Classroom Newsletter. I'm Alan Semro with Magna Publications, and I'll be the moderator today. And now I'm pleased to introduce Brian Uterman. Brian Uterman, PhD, has more than 20 years of teaching experience in higher education. He started teaching online in 2005 and has served as the Director of Online Education at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse since 2007. In addition to his administrative duties, he facilitates online workshops through the OLC and is an alumnus of OLC's Institute for Emerging Leadership in Online Learning. Uterman has published more than 70 peer-reviewed scientific manuscripts, 5 book chapters, and 2 books, and has done more than 200 national and international presentations. Welcome, Brian.
Thanks, Alan, and welcome everyone, and super glad you decided to join us for this Magna Online seminar. And I'll just kind of repeat a little bit of what Alan said. I think it was back in 2004, something propelled me to teach my first online class, so I designed it in 2004 and then taught it in 2005. And if you'd have told me in 2005 when I first started teaching this online class that by 2007 I would serve as the director of online education for our entire university, I would have said, there's absolutely no way because I'm just now getting into this. But many times that's how it happens. Someone kind of takes the leap in a program or in a department, and then they kind of become the person that everybody turns to and looks to for help with the LMS or facilitating discussions or developing content or whatever it is. And I was thinking back to 2002, 2003, 2004 as I was developing this seminar, and one thing that really propelled me to teach online was back in 2003, I think it was, either 2002 or 3, we had switched learning management systems we were using Blackboard, and then we switched to D2L or Desire to Learn. And I thought I was really advanced technology-wise because I was posting my syllabus, in the LMS. But for some reason, one semester I decided to set up an online discussion forum. But this was in my face-to-face class, and I know now a lot of instructors are certainly doing that. And I had no idea what I was doing. There was no grades affiliated with it. I didn't even create a prompt or a question or an activity, nothing. I just told students that, hey, this is available in our class, this discussion forum thing, and if you ever want to go out there and interact with each other, you certainly can. And nothing happened for about a week or a week and a half. And then after a lecture one day, I was walking from the lecture hall back to my office, and in that time period, a student had posted something about the lecture, something they actually found interesting, and another student kind of started to chime in. And it was a pretty big class, but it was pretty interesting that from that point on, there was a group of students who would enter the discussion forum and, at different times, and they would talk about things that were covered in the lecture. And again, this was for my face-to-face class, so that was one of the things I think that in 2004 got me interested in developing a fully online class and then teaching that for the first time in 2005. So really, my goal is to just share some ideas, some tips, and some strategies, some ways maybe that I think instructors can improve their online discussion forums. And I really enjoy talking about this topic, online discussions, because I've had the opportunity to work with maybe 250 instructors at my institution over the last 10 years or so who've developed and taught their first online course. And I can tell you that not always, but many times there's some frustration there with instructors in regards to their online discussion forums and how much work they might be, or if students are not participating in being engaged in the forums. But usually I have found that just making a few changes, maybe some of the things that we're going to talk about today, can have a pretty positive impact on the discussion forum. So lots of frustration there, or there can be lots of frustration, but making a few changes could really help with the quality of the discussion forums. Briefly, I just would like to say that just in general, we continue to see, at least at my institution, and I know across the country, the growth in online education. Students continue to be interested in taking online courses, and faculty continue to be interested in teaching online courses. So even though overall we see enrollment in higher education starting to drop just a little bit, we're continuing to see growth, and specifically in the area of online enrollments. And most instructors who teach online classes utilize discussion forums in their courses, not all. We don't require the use of discussion forums at my institution. I know some institutions do that. Maybe we can get into that a little bit later if you have questions on that. That's nothing I've ever even considered implementing at my institution over the last 10 years. But again, I know that some institutions do. But most of our instructors, when they're teaching online, will utilize discussion forums in their online classes. And again, briefly, why instructors are using these forums and what they think they get from them. And this is supported in the literature. Some of the research that's been out there come out in the last 5 to 10, even 15 years. So when you're using forums, certainly a way to get students interacting with each other and with potentially you, the instructor. So, enhancing, increasing engagement in your class. Many of the instructors that I've had the pleasure of working with over the last 10 years, really one of their purposes for utilizing online discussion forums is this idea of relationship building, that students can build relationships with each other and with you, the instructor. You can get to know your students a little bit better. So this idea of building a community within an online class, and then certainly to go deeper with course content. So that last bullet there, to enhance learning. So I just wanted to share some reasons why instructors use discussions. And I did want to mention this because I have had many, many conversations with many faculty who are just kind of at the point where they're interested in teaching online. And one thing that I hear over and over and over again and have heard many, many times from instructors who have never taught online but are thinking about it is that first bullet there. Kind of one of their major fears or major concerns is that they'll lose this connection that they have with their students, the ability to see them, the ability to, they really got that, or they're struggling to get this concept. And even like these rich, amazing discussions that occur in face-to-face classes. So sometimes faculty say that they're afraid they're going to lose that. And I find that interesting. I used to teach in face-to-face classrooms and had some great class periods, and, students would participate and we'd have some wonderful discussions sometimes, but not all the time. That second bullet there, one of the more common complaints I've heard from face-to-face instructors. I've worked in the Center for Advancing Teaching and Learning for the last 10 years, and certainly one of the major complaints from instructors interacting with their students in a face-to-face classroom is that it's tough sometimes to get them to speak up, to get them to engage, to get them to participate, to get them to discuss with each other. In that last bullet there, most of the time, again, not always, but the vast majority of time when I interact with faculty after they taught online for the first time, they've had a good experience with that. Probably 85 to 90% of our online instructors continue to teach online, and nationally, if you look at benchmarks, if 80% of your instructors that teach online for the first time continue to teach online in the future, that's a pretty good number. And most say that they're impressed by the students, by their participation, by the depth of the conversations that they have in their online discussion forums. But again, we're going to talk about some ideas and strategies today to make that even better. A couple of very, very quick polling questions for you. So if you would, just simple yes or no question here. And the first one is, do you currently use discussion forums in your online courses? So it looks like the majority are using discussion forums in your online courses. I kind of figured that was the case. And the next question is, would you say you are very satisfied, I know that's somewhat subjective, but very satisfied with the quality of your online discussions? Okay, so looks like some of you are saying that you're pretty satisfied with what's going on or what your faculty are doing, and some of you are saying no. All right, so let's kind of get into the meat. And I will say, I looked at the participant list for the seminar today, and this topic of online discussion forums has been pretty popular over the last 3 to 5 to 7, even 10 years, and continues to be. And I was kind of struck by the variety of participants in regards to their jobs and what they do. So certainly there are some faculty signed up for this seminar, some department chairs, a variety of administrators, department chairs, deans, even vice chancellors, program directors, a number of instructional designers, a number of folks from teaching centers. So I do think that this topic will continue to be of interest as we continue to teach more online courses and degree programs in the future. All right, so let's get into the strategies. I'll try and get through these somewhat quickly because I actually had 12 and I had to cut it down, so I'd love to mention the 5 at the end if we have time for that. So the first one is figure out how many. What's the number? And I can tell you, having worked with many instructors, that they kind of default to, if my class is 15 weeks long, then I'm going to do 15 discussion forums. Or if there's 20 units or modules, then I'm going to do 20 discussion forums. And you certainly don't have to do that. So feedback from our online students. We survey our online students every year and a half or 2 years or so, students at our institution. And probably 5, 6, maybe even 7 years ago, our students started saying, I started seeing a theme, and many students were saying, like, the discussion forums are just really boring, and it just feels like it's more busy work than anything else. And again, if instructors feel like they are teaching a 15-week class and they need to do 15 online discussion forums, then I could see how students would feel like that might be repetitive and redundant and kind of boring, and it's just week after week after week. Some instructors will do 2 per unit discussion forums or 2 per week, and that gets to be very, very overwhelming. So think about the number. And that last bullet there, this is something where I always try to have a discussion with a faculty member before they teach online. Like, why are you using discussion forums in your class? Is it just because it's an online class and you think that that's what you're supposed to be doing? So what's the purpose? Like, what's the meaning? What are the students going to learn? What do you want them to achieve based upon their participation in these forums? Are your discussion forums activities tied into the student learning outcomes for the class? And even tell that to students, so make it clear up front. The reason you are participating in the discussion forum this week is because it's directly aligned or tied to the student learning outcome for in the class, which is, students will identify or whatever it is. So make it clear to students why they're participating. And I think that really helps with this idea of the forums seeming more like busy work for students. All right, so again, that first one is identify your optimal number. And oftentimes when I interact with new instructors after they're done teaching their first online class, they say, this part of my class, the discussion forums, was overwhelming. There were too many. I spent way too much time. I was reading and I was responding and I was grading and I was overwhelmed, and I think my students were overwhelmed. And not always, but many times then they back off the number. If they had 14, they'll reduce that greatly, or they'll cut it in half. They might go down to 7. And then be a little bit more strategic. Again, what's the purpose? What's the meaning? But when are they located? If you have a particular week of a class where there's a midterm, or students have to turn in a 20-page research paper or a big project, maybe that's a nice point in the class that particular week or unit to not have a discussion forum. But many times, instructors will back off. So this idea of less is more, not so repetitive, not so redundant, not so much like busy work for students, but there's more purpose and meaning there with what they're doing in regards to forums. Number 2, this is a tough one, especially for new instructors. Determine how much you will participate in. Again, I've had many, many conversations with lots of different folks on this, and there's really no right answer. There are many different philosophies. We review online courses at my institution, so once they get developed, and then many times after they've been taught, we'll sit down with a faculty member. I sit down with them and our 2 instructional designers, and we have a conversation. And it is interesting that some instructors feel like they really need to be or really want to be involved with students, like heavily in a variety of different areas in the class, but the online discussion forums is one. Other instructors say, I just kind of want to be more hands-off. I want to let students kind of take the rein and do their thing and kind of stay out of the way. And for me, it took a good year or year and a half, so 3 semesters, 4 semesters, something like that, to kind of figure this out for me. What was my optimal level of involvement? And that last bullet there, you hear this all the time. If an instructor is participating too much, it could likely result in students kind of backing away and saying, well, I'm not going to jump in. Or if an instructor is not doing all that much, there's no instructor presence there, so then it's too little, and then students wonder where they are. Why are they getting paid to teach this class if they're not interacting with us and sharing their insights? things like that. But again, I think every instructor is certainly different, and they have to do what is comfortable for them. And I see this changing with teaching experience. And the change that I most often see is backing off a little bit, not participating quite so much. So becoming a little bit more of a facilitator in regards to online discussion forums than always being there and participating quite so much from instructors. All right, strategy 3. So create more interesting and engaging prompts. And I will say, of any of the strategies that I'm going to talk about today, this would probably be number 1 on the list. And so what I sometimes see with new instructors is not a lot of thought and creativity put into the discussion forum prompts or questions or activities on the front end. So we review these classes, 40 or 50 a year at my institution. And so we look at what are the discussion forum prompts. And oftentimes there are questions that are kind of boring. There might only be one right answer or 2 right answers. They're not reflective questions. They're not thought-provoking questions. So then I'll ask the faculty member, did you come up with these questions, or where are they from? And on more than one occasion, instructors will say, well, I just went to the back of the chapter in the textbook and I utilized questions from the textbook. And I'm not saying you can't do that, but putting a little bit more work into it on the front end usually results in better outcomes, on the back end. I did a presentation, this is probably 6 or 7 years ago, at a conference, and there was a more experienced business faculty there. I'd been teaching for many years, but probably 3 or 4 or 5 years before I did this presentation, they decided to get into online teaching and had some experience, at that point where I had given this presentation. And he was super open, and he said for a number of years he was just very frustrated with his students in regards to their participation in the forums. And then he kind of came to a realization that maybe a little bit of it maybe was his fault, in that the things that he was asking the students to write about, to think about, to reflect on, they were just kind of boring. So he had made some changes, writing better questions, having better prompts, and I'll talk about maybe even replacing questions with some activities. And he said once that happened, he started to see the overall quality of what his students were doing improve. So just a couple of examples. Years ago, I taught an online health and wellness class, and as part of the class, there was a nutrition lecture. And I had a discussion forum question. It was something like, why is it important to pay attention to sample size or serving size, on a food label? And students are pretty smart. They figured that out right away, or they knew the answer. You want to look at a serving size of whatever it is you might be eating. So you're eating potato chips, and, what's the serving size? It's 10 chips. So it's important to pay attention, because if you eat 30 chips, then instead of taking in, say, 100 calories, if that's how many were in one serving, you would take in 300 calories. So every student said the same thing over and over and over again, and it got pretty boring pretty quickly. And I noticed that, and I decided to change the activity. Actually just got rid of the question and had students do an activity. So ask students to go into their closets or their cupboards or their refrigerators and pull out 4 or 5 or 6 things that they ate on a consistent basis or drank on a consistent basis, and said, look at the label, look at the serving size, and then report something back that you found interesting or kind of shocking in the online discussion forum. And it was very, very interesting, the discussions that occurred because of the fact that students were going out and actually doing something, especially looking at things that they were eating or drinking, on a consistent day-to-day basis. Things like, oh my goodness, I never realized that, a serving of ice cream is a half a cup, because I'd never looked at that before. And then they measured out how much they usually have 2 cups or 2.5 cups. So again, instead of taking in 130 calories, you multiply 130 times 5 or 6. But I think students found that somewhat interesting, because they were actually, engaging in some activity and then following that up with some discussions with other students in the discussion forum. There's an instructor at my institution who teaches a criminal justice class, and they have their online students, so these could be students in Wisconsin or Minnesota or Kentucky, all over the country, attend an AA meeting. He that's one of the things that they talk about in the class. So students in this online class have to find an AA meeting, have to find the sponsor, get approval from the sponsor to attend the class, go to the meeting and introduce themselves, share why they're there, and then participate in the meeting. Following that experience, students then have an activity that they complete in an online discussion forum in the class. So again, going beyond just asking a simple question about maybe attending an AA meeting or what might the benefits be, or students actually have some experience and they're able to reflect on that. And the instructor said the discussions are very, very rich and the students have lots of different experiences in the different meetings. So just a couple of examples of how you can go beyond simply asking a question. And certainly with questions, I mentioned this before, but try to avoid things that, are yes or no questions or have one right answer, things that are a little bit more maybe thought-provoking, reflective in nature. And other things that I see more instructors doing now versus maybe 8 or 10 years ago in regards to discussion forums. Having students go out and find information, maybe doing a little research and coming back and reporting that in the discussion forum. Maybe it's credible websites or sharing videos so students would watch a 12-minute video clip. And then you, the instructor, would build a discussion forum activity around that video. So there's lots of different ways to kind of spice it up or jazz it up a little bit, make it a little bit more interesting for students, but certainly think about that on the front end. All right, I'm going to take a quick break and just let me know if anybody has any questions at this point. I find that I struggle with getting students to participate with quality responses. How do we overcome their lack of interest in writing more content responses? Let me kind of just give a couple of thoughts. So one, I think sometimes instructors struggle with making sure their expectations for students are very clear, whether that's an initial post or response to peers, and whether they're on point or not. One of the things I'm going to talk about later on, but I'll just talk about it now, is grading to your expectations early on. I've found that to be incredibly helpful. So if you share a rubric and students know what to expect in regards to like what your expectations are and grading expectations. And I've just have found that sometimes some instructors don't make that clear to students. So some instructors want students to be really reflective in their participation in the discussion forum, or they want them to really dig deep and, go deeper with course content, or, have these wonderful interactions with other students, but students are not clear on that. And we hear that all the time with online courses, like make sure you share your expectations. So that's one. Don't think that you're going to write your initial response and then, it's going to be over. So you need to pay attention to how you're responding and the quality of your responses to other students. And then if students aren't meeting that expectation and things are clearly laid out in your rubric, then grade it appropriately. So grade your expectations early on. If students have 3 points that are available, or 5 points or 10 points for their responses to their peers, and they did a poor job and say they scored 1 out of 5, which was appropriate for their quality or level of work, that will get their attention. But what I see so many instructors do is they kind of grade leniently, and then, if a student submitted a poor response and you gave them a 4 out of 5 or a 5 out of 5, then the next, you're going to get the same quality of work and same level of engagement. So let them know what your expectations are and then grade to that early on. And if you do give a 2 out of 5 or a 1 out of 5, be specific in your feedback to students. Here's the reason you got the score that you did. Love the idea of giving the students an activity and then discuss it based on the assignments and textbook. I teach a lot of service learning assignments, and this will work nicely to get students off the computer and into the real world. Absolutely. So anytime you can have students, this is just my opinion, go beyond simply just responding to a question. In some of our classes, especially at the graduate level, oh my goodness, there's so many things. You talk about authentic assignments, and many of our online students, again, at the graduate level, are working full-time. I'm just thinking about our Student Affairs Administration program and some of the activities based around these classes, some discussion forums, so students could solve some type of a problem, where they work. Maybe they don't have a policy and procedures manual on something, or maybe they need to develop a training related to something. And these are usually assignments that are doable. So whatever it might might be addressing a need or a concern or a problem where they work. So these students then are doing that and then sharing what they did and getting feedback and how it worked. So yeah, anytime you can pull in that real world or real life component, I think is, certainly a benefit for students. And it keeps students interested because they see the real benefit for what they're doing or of what they're doing. Sarah, on the topic of too much or too little in your experience, have you found a way to quantify or describe just right? Absolutely not. So I will say this. Most of our regular semester fall and spring courses are, 14 or 15 weeks long. And I've read a couple of research studies that try to figure out just what that right number is. And I've seen, kind of 7 plus or minus 1 maybe. So 5 or 6 on the low end, 8 or 9 on the high end. But again, what I was doing, I had 7 assignments, in my class. So I thought if it's a week when there's an assignment, we don't necessarily have to have a discussion that week. And again, some schools require that. Some schools require a discussion forum every week, and they're measuring the number of words, and they're real strict on that. But I love the idea of, do something every other week. Your students are still engaged. They're still working on the class. They're still interacting with each other. And maybe, instead of doing the discussion forums for 1 week, you can spread it out over 2 weeks. So you kind of take the pressure off students to they get the post done and to respond, and grading pressure for the instructors might be a little bit less. I guess the flip side to that is if you spread it out over 2 weeks, maybe it might be a little bit harder to keep students engaged with each other. But that's one of the things that you as an instructor can do is send out reminders, try and keep discussions or conversations going by asking additional questions, or, oh, that was a great thought, or what did you really mean by this, or where did you find that information? So if I would have to pick a number, I would say during a regular semester, 6 to 8 discussions. Now, it gets a little tougher if it's a 3-week class or a 4-week class or a 6-week class. That's probably something you just have to, experiment and play around with a little bit. Another question, how do you help instructors come to this understanding without suggesting that what they're doing now is subpar? Yeah, Sean, that's a great question. I don't know, I've been interacting with our instructional designers, with our faculty for the last 8 or 10 years, and I have just found that we try to develop a good relationship with our faculty to the point where they trust things that we're sharing with them. And I came up through the faculty ranks, so sometimes I think our instructional designers struggle with this a little bit more. But I think the biggest thing for me is just in how I word things. Honestly, it sounds so simple, but when we do our recommendations, when we do these online course reviews, sometimes we have 6 or 8 or 10 or 15 or 20 recommendations for faculty, and they usually start with, you might want to think about, or consider adding, or consider replacing this activity with something a little bit different. And our instructional designers have gotten to be really good at that. So if a faculty member has a discussion forum, maybe they have 8 of them in their class, but every one is text-based, our instructional designers sometimes say, you might just want to consider doing something that's a little bit different, using some media or some technology, doing a voice thread discussion instead of just using the online discussion forum in the LMS. So if you talk to instructional designers, they certainly will say this. It comes down to having a good relationship with faculty. So you get to the point where they are listening or maybe even just considering some of the recommendations that you're giving them. But wording, I found that wording is very, very helpful. Very rarely do we say, this is something you have to do or change in your class. It's always consider, think about, that type of thing. All right. So strategy 4, this is a big one, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I think it's important, and that is deal with concerns immediately. So most of the time when I interact with faculty, after they've taught a class, I almost always ask them, what were the students like? Did you have any issues with netiquette or someone being rude with other students? And rarely do I hear of serious issues. Sometimes, especially if you have a class where maybe the content is a little bit more edgy or you could be a little bit more prone to that, a little more controversial. But very rarely do I hear of something serious. And most learning management systems now, I would say all of them, allow you, the instructor, to remove a post and remove a student if you need to get things to settle down. So most of you are familiar with netiquette guidelines. Make sure you share those with your students. Some of our instructors One activity that they do with their students in the first week of class is they come up with an etiquette guidelines. So students feel like they have some buy-in there or some ownership to them. And one of our history instructors actually does, and one of our student affairs administration instructors, they'll have a discussion with their students during the first week of class about discussions. Do you want to do them? What have you found beneficial in other courses? What have you hated about online discussion forums in your other courses? What have you loved? What do you want to do? How can we do things in this class so you have a good experience with online discussions? Maybe ask how many, maybe ask topics. So there are certainly things you can do as an instructor to get feedback from students, and some instructors don't do that enough to help make discussion forums be successful in your class. So when things happen, thinking back to my teaching, nothing serious ever happened, but every once in a while a student would be like right on the edge of, something that might be deemed inappropriate. I would just send out a reminder. Just a reminder, etiquette is important. Be polite, be respectful. You can disagree with each other, but it's always being polite, being professional, being respectful. And most of the time that seemed to take care of the problem or the issue. Strategy number 5 is, I mentioned this before, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but this for me was thinking back to creating more engaging and interesting activities and prompts. That was a big one that elevated, I think, the quality overall of the discussion forums in my classes. But I found the first time I taught, I was pretty easy in regards to grading. If a student submitted something that was kind of not very good, I would still give them a pretty good grade. And then again, that's what they continued to do. So eventually, 2 semesters or 3 semesters or 4 semesters after I started teaching online, I then started using a rubric. I didn't when I first started. I made sure my expectations for my students were clear. And then I started doing this, grading to my expectations early on. So again, clear expectations, students know what's expected of them, you can provide a rubric, and it's kind of an eye-opener because again, if a student receives a 2 out of 5 on, a discussion forum activity and you have 6 of those in class or 10 of those in class or even more, then the loss in points is going to add up. But again, as long as you let students know, here's the reason why you got a 1 out of 5. And then most of the time, the next time students participate, the next unit, the next week, the next module, they will have corrected that. And overall, that results in higher quality participation from your students. Utilize guest experts. So this is something that instructors do many, many times in their face-to-face classes, but I don't see this done quite as often in online classes. So I do think even if you're like a great instructor, you're a phenomenal online teacher, you're funny and you're engaging and you're everything, having guest speakers or a guest expert somehow woven into your class can provide some variety for students. And I think, at least looking back over the last 20 years in my teaching, both face-to-face and online, I think students have appreciated that, and I think they do appreciate that. And then who to invite. So maybe you know the author of your textbook. Maybe you know the president of your state or national association. I mean, that'd be pretty impressive to your students if that was the individual who was invited to participate in class. Or, I used to teach a health class and I had a lecture on cardiovascular health and used to pull someone in who had quadruple bypass surgery to share what their experience was with their students. So this isn't necessarily an academic expert on the topic, but someone who has experience with what you're talking about in class. And then certainly this can be set up in a number of different ways. So I've done this where we've brought someone into a class for a day. We brought someone into a class for a week. You can set it up potentially so you're doing something more synchronously or, live if you just want to pull in somebody for an hour. So that's something you can do. That's something that you would want to set up with the person that you're inviting to class. But again, lots of different ways. I've seen instructors who have had their students submit questions, and now the guest expert can just respond to questions, and then the answers to those questions could result in follow-up conversations or follow-up discussions, or maybe if it's a synchronous event, then that guest can do that in a live session where students could ask follow-up questions. So strategy number 7, I think this is an important one just overall for online education. Model what you expect, but I do think this is very important for online discussion forums. So this might be just the overall tone and demeanor in the class. Are you positive? Are you enthusiastic? Are you sharing small little comments with your students? Again, just things like, Sarah, that was a fantastic post, or that was very creative, or that was very thoughtful, because students pick up on that pretty quickly, or are you kind of more short and a little bit harsh in regards to how you're responding? So again, students notice that and they pick up on that very quickly. So I would just say pay attention to that. And this idea of instructor presence is huge, and there's a lot of ways that instructors can demonstrate their presence in online classes, and we could do an entire seminar on that. But I do think participation in discussion forums is one of the primary ways you as an instructor can do that without overwhelming a conversation, but just participating, just reinforcing, just asking some additional questions, sharing your thoughts and your perspectives on whatever is happening within the discussion certainly is a way to demonstrate your presence. Some instructors who don't post a lot, they're not in the discussion participating a lot, will do a summary at the very end of a week or a unit of a module, and they'll say things like, the discussion forum this week was just really fantastic. Here are like 4 or 5 themes that emerged. I was super impressed that you picked this out. So that's, again, another way to participate without not necessarily being there all the time and doing a lot of posting. All right, so just some final thoughts. So really give some thought to how many more instructors that I'm interacting with are actually utilizing fewer discussion forums. This idea of how much you participate. Thinking back to my teaching, I have the opportunity to facilitate some workshops that faculty participate in. One of them is on facilitating effective online discussions, and I tend to not be heavy in my participation early on. Some people say, be heavy early on, that way you model good participation, and then you kind of back off and let students take over. Other instructors say, I don't do much early on, and I let students jump right in, and then I'll pick up my participation, as the weeks go on. I tend to do neither of those things. I tend to have pretty constant and steady participation and interaction with students from the very beginning. But again, this is different for every instructor, and I think it changes based upon the number of years you've been teaching or semesters that you taught a class. And it certainly can change even based upon the student makeup of a class that you're in. If you got a class that's very active, participating a lot, then maybe your participation can just kind of back off a little bit. Or if you have students that need some poking and prodding and getting them a little bit more involved, and maybe they're shy. Sometimes online students can be shy, so then you might have to do a little bit more in regards to facilitation, getting students involved. More engaged prompts, talked about that. So ultimately, I think that could overall increase students' interest in the forums and then improve the overall quality of the forums as well. And be clear on directions and expectations. Very, very important. Okay. I do want to just share some other ideas. One is to provide some choice. So you might give students 2 or 3 questions or prompts or options or activities, and then let them select the one that they're most interested in. I've worked with lots of faculty who have utilized this strategy or this technique, and they love it. The students usually report good feedback on it because, again, a student can pick the prompt or the activity that they're most interested in. One thing that popped into my mind when I have discussions with the instructors who do this is, well, if everybody picks the same option, then maybe there's 15 in one and 2 in the other. But the instructors that I've talked to said very rarely is that the case. So usually students self-select and the groups are pretty even. Another idea, just in regards to choice, is to use technology. So this might be with creating prompts. It might be responding. Many learning management systems now will allow students to, you can write the post, or you could actually record it and do it via audio, or you could do it audio and create a video. So your initial response could be a video, or it could be a podcast or audio, again, done pretty easily right within the learning management system. And then as you respond to other students, you could do that via audio or via video as well. And certainly there are some tools out there like VoiceThread that you could use to do that as well, but many learning management systems now have the option of doing that or have the functionality of doing that. So provide some choice. Number two is provide examples of high quality posts and maybe posts that would be scored a little bit lower. So you could pull these from former students in prior classes, certainly get their permission to use that. I mean, you as an instructor could make them up, but I think this really helps with that expectations piece. Like, this is what I'm looking for if you want to receive a 5 out of 5 on what you're doing. This would be a 2 out of 5, but you're sharing some of those examples with your students. Another idea is to liven up your introduction or your icebreaker. Many online instructors do icebreakers in their classes, and when we review these classes, we often see share your name, what year you are in school, what's your major, and then why you're interested in taking this class. And that's absolutely fine. That's great. You can certainly do that. But I would say maybe just go beyond that a little bit and do something fun. One very common one is share 3 things about yourself, and 2 of them are true and 1 is not true, and then other students have to try and figure out which ones. So that's just an idea. Back when I was teaching that health class, one thing I did as part of the introduction forum was I had students go out on the internet and magazines, wherever they could find things related to health that were kind of outrageous. Maybe it was about exercise, piece of equipment, use this piece of equipment and gain 10 pounds of muscle in 15 minutes, or use this supplement and lose 20 pounds in 20 days, or whatever it was. So, yeah, it was pretty neat. Students would share infomercials, and they would share commercials and videos and things that they found in newspapers and magazines, and oftentimes those things related to what we were going to be covering in a class in the next week or 2 or 3. And then don't close it after a week necessarily. You kind of keep the conversation going. That introduction or that icebreaker, keep it open for 2 weeks or 3 weeks or throughout the semester if students are utilizing it. Another idea is get your students involved. So some instructors might leave a gap, halfway through the class or 3/4 of the way through the class, and then allow students to actually create the prompt or the activity for the discussion forum that we can let them know up front that they're going to be doing that so they can be thinking about it. But get your students involved. Some instructors have students moderate discussions, so they might moderate a discussion, the instructor, for a week or 2, again, modeling what it would look like, and then they wrote their students through that role. And then some instructors have this as a graded activity for their students. Have students create summaries of discussions is another way to get them involved. So I mentioned before some instructors do that, but some instructors have a graded activity where students have to be the one to come up with the 4 or 5 themes that emerge throughout the week, and then the students would post that as a summary for the week or the unit or the module. And again, that could certainly be a graded activity. And then the last idea is to pull in those students that don't seem to be contributing a lot. So maybe it's a student who hasn't posted yet or participated at all, and it's getting close to the point where the deadline is approaching, or maybe if the deadline is just passed, to make sure that the student's still in class and they're going to participate. Maybe even with students who are doing the absolute minimum, and you can kind of figure that out as the instructor. Just a little note from you or some encouragement can sometimes increase their participation. So sometimes just a gentle nudge and some enthusiasm from you and some encouragement from you can help get students more involved if they're not contributing. I mean, online can be just like the face-to-face classroom at times. You could have, a student, 2 students, 3 students who kind of take over the discussion forums, and they respond to everybody, and their posts or their responses are very, very long, and sometimes students can kind of get tired of hearing from them. So the more you can do as an instructor to pull in everyone in the class, more viewpoints, I think the more successful your discussions will be. Okay. Sorry, I had 7, 1 over 5, so there really was a dozen. All right, so we do have some time if you have questions. What about groups in group work? Great question. Some of our faculty use groups in all their face-to-face classes, some in all their online classes, some don't use groups. If you talk to students, I think many times they say they're kind of grouped out. So I go back to what I said before, kind of about what's the purpose or what's the meaning. Are you using groups just to use groups? So if you do use groups, I would say hold off. Think about timing. So maybe wait for a week or two until after like the drop period for the class, because if you set groups up during week 1 and then all of a sudden 4 students or 8 students drop the class, I mean, that could muck up the number of folks in your group. So that's one. Another is make sure the expectations are really clear, especially if you're setting up roles. Someone in a group is the moderator, and someone's the recorder, and someone's the one who needs to go out and get the resources or do the research. So clear expectations, especially if they're going to be grading each other in the group. Number is always a big one, and there's not a lot in regards to research out there. Most instructional designers will say, well, if you want to do a little bit more of the relationship community building, then keep the group smaller, 3 or 4 or 5. If you want to have more viewpoints, then maybe more, like 8 or 10 or 12. You know, when I facilitate these online workshops with faculty, I like larger groups, usually 10 to 12, because I found that that's not overwhelming in regards to the number of posts that are read and are shared, but you still get a pretty good in regards to viewpoints and different perspectives. It's a little bit more robust. Do you sometimes need to rein in a student? Yeah, absolutely. In a very polite and friendly way. You know, I do this with faculty because that's who I'm interacting more now with. But just a little reminder, sometimes I'll say, oh, you know, Tim, just so you're aware, I see that you're posting a lot and that's great, but it's not required for you to participate or to respond to every person in the class or in the workshop every time they post. And that's a really tough one. And you know, I don't mean to be offensive here, but, you know, I see that you're interacting a lot with other participants, and sometimes the more someone participates, the less that other people pay attention to them. So figuring out a way to say that's not offensive. I mean, ultimately, you're probably going to hurt their feelings anyway a little bit, but do that in a way that's polite and respectful. Hope that was helpful. All right, thank you very much for joining us, and I'm going to hand it back over to Alan.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you to everybody for joining us today. Complete information about our upcoming seminars is available at www.magnapubs.com. Thanks again for joining us, and thank you, Brian, and have a great afternoon.